Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before his entire world collapsed. Laura Bennett wipes down the nurse's station at Cedar Creek Medical in Philadelphia, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in plastic, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nostrils. She's been here 3 months. Invisible. Competent. Arriving at 5:06 a.m., leaving at 6:23 p.m. Never early enough to draw attention, never late enough to seem unreliable. Her locker contains only scrubs, a spare pair of compression socks, and a locked box she never opens. Inside that box sits a pair of worn combat boots, laces still holding the knots from Fallujah, leather cracked like old maps where the desert sun had baked them during a medevac under enemy fire. She doesn't think about the boots during the day. Room for 47 sits at the end of the third-floor corridor, and Laura's vitals check happens at 7:15 a.m. before the surgical staff arrives. An elderly deaf Army Ranger lies in the adjustable bed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone who's learned to breathe through pain. He stares past her face without recognition every time she checks his full line, every time she adjusts the oxygen sensor clip to his index finger. His name is inscribed on her forearm in tattoo ink that never fades, but he wouldn't know that even if he could hear her speak it. She adjusts his fall with hands that don't shake, her movements precise and economy-driven, the kind of economy that comes from 12 years of field medicine under fire. One motion. No wasted energy. Before repositioned. The line running clear. She makes a note on his chart and moves on before the morning shift chaos begins. A fellow nurse named Marcus stops her in the supply room and comments on the faded scars along Laura's forearms, thin white lines that run parallel like railroad tracks, some older than others, some still slightly pink at the edges. He asks if she was in an accident. Laura deflects with a half-smile that doesn't reach her eyes and changes the subject to the new compression bandages they'd received that morning. Marcus accepts this without pressing further. Everyone at Cedar Creek has learned not to press further with Laura Bennett. She's pleasant. She's professional. She's also someone you don't ask follow-up questions about. Late that night, long after the day shift nurses have clocked out and the evening crew has settled into their routines, Laura sits alone in the records room on the 4th floor. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly white glow. She's reviewing post-operative billing codes from the last 6 weeks, cross-referencing surgical supply charges against the actual inventory logs maintained by purchasing. The discrepancies appear in her hands like a code she's being asked to crack. Dr. Caldwell's cases show inflated charges for surgical supplies, 14-gauge angiocath needles listed at 3 times their actual cost, sutures billed at premium rates for standard stock, electrosurgical units leased at rates that don't match any legitimate vendor contract she can locate. The pattern repeats across surgical cases 447 through 521, all from the past 8 weeks, all under Caldwell's name in the surgeon field. She makes notes in her personal file, a small notebook with a spiral binding that she keeps in her scrub pocket. She documents the case numbers, the dates, the specific line items that don't reconcile. Her handwriting is precise and tiny, the kind of writing someone learns to do in dim light when noise discipline matters. She doesn't yet know that someone is watching her through the records room window. Dr. Caldwell stands in the hallway outside, watching Laura's profile as she writes, watching her frown deepen with each discrepancy she documents. His jaw tightens. His hands form fists that he releases, forms again. He's been at Cedar Creek Medical for 18 years. He's built a reputation that spans surgical departments across 3 states. He's published papers on minimally invasive thoracic procedures. He's got a boat. He's got a house in the Rittenhouse Square neighborhood worth $2.3 million. He's got offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that have been absorbing kickbacks from a medical supply company for the past 4 years, commissions paid for inflated billing, for unnecessary procedures, for supply charges that don't exist in the actual delivery manifests but do appear in the hospital's records. $347,000 has flowed into those accounts since he started the arrangement with the supply vendor's sales director, a man named Pierce Sterling who wears suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And now a nurse who's been at the hospital for 12 weeks is sitting alone at midnight reviewing his billing codes. He walks away from the window and pulls out his phone. The next morning arrives like every other morning at Cedar Creek. Laura clocks in at 5:54 a.m. She checks on the ranger in room for 47, finds him stable, his oxygen saturation at 97%, his heart rate steady at 68. She adjusts his pillows with the kind of mechanical precision that suggests she's done this motion 10,000 times before. She doesn't speak to him. He wouldn't hear her anyway. She leaves his room and heads to the nurse's station to begin the morning documentation. Dr. Caldwell enters the nurse's station at 7:33 a.m., right as the day shift is starting to gather, right as staffing meetings are being called and patient assignments are being distributed. He watches Laura from across the room. His eyes narrow as he sees the billing folder still sitting on her desk, open to page 3, where his case numbers are highlighted in yellow marker. The folder sits there like an accusation. Like a threat. Like the beginning of a problem that he has decided needs solving this morning, right now, in front of everyone. He gathers the surgical staff in the cafeteria at 7:02 a.m. The cafeteria at Cedar Creek Medical smells like burnt coffee and the ghost of breakfast, eggs congealing under heat lamps, toast going stale in metal bins, the perpetual antiseptic undertone that seems to seep into everything at a hospital. 23 people stand or sit scattered throughout the space. Caldwell stands at the center with the posture of someone used to being the center. His voice carries the weight of authority that comes from 18 years and 23,000 hours and having trained most of the surgeons in the room. "We have a new nurse," Caldwell says, his eyes finding Laura as she enters with a lunch tray she picked up at 7:42 a.m. Only been here 3 months. And she's already becoming a problem. Laura doesn't flinch. She doesn't look up. She walks toward an empty table with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from having learned, a long time ago, that showing fear is a tactical error. "The new girl," Caldwell continues, his voice dropping into the register of someone making a joke to his friends, "won't last a week. I'd bet money on it." The room produces laughter. Scattered at first, then gaining momentum, the sound of a group giving themselves permission to laugh at something they've been invited to find funny. Laura sits down. She picks up her sandwich. She is precisely 8 feet and 4 inches from Drive Caldwell. He walks toward her. The sandwich is turkey on wheat bread with mustard and lettuce. The coffee in her thermos is black, brewed at 5:22 a.m., still warm. The apple on her tray is medium-sized, red, picked from the fruit bin this morning. These details matter because what happens next will be remembered by everyone in the room, and details are what stick when people try to explain what they saw. Caldwell reaches her table from the left side, approaching at a 45-degree angle, moving with the casual confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He looks down at her lunch tray. He looks at her face. He reaches out and knocks the tray from her hands with his forearm, a sweeping motion that is careful enough not to spill on himself, deliberate enough that no one could mistake it as accidental. The tray clatters. The plate breaks. The sandwich scatters across the linoleum floor. The coffee thermos rolls in a slow arc, the lid popping free, liquid spreading in a dark stain that smells like bitter almonds and heat. The apple bounces twice and settles under a nearby chair. Scattered across the floor in a chaotic pattern are the various documents that Laura had in her pocket, charts, notes, patient files, all of them now spreading across the tile like evidence of something she hasn't yet done. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Caldwell says, his voice carrying to every corner of the cafeteria. The laughter returns. Louder this time. More confident. The sound of permission. Laura doesn't move for 2.7 seconds. Her jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. Her hands, which are folded on the table in front of her, clench slightly, then release. Her breathing remains steady. She stands slowly. She kneels to gather the papers, moving with a kind of controlled precision that suggests she is not thinking about her lunch, not thinking about the laughter, not thinking about the fact that every person in this room is watching her pick up a sandwich and broken plate. Her hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't crack when she speaks to herself, barely audible, barely a whisper, interesting approach to establishing hierarchy. She gathers each paper individually. She collects the fragments of broken plate carefully. She retrieves the thermos from under a table and sets it upright. The apple she picks up last, examining it briefly for cracks before depositing it on a nearby trash bin. She walks to a housekeeping station and disposes of the broken tray, then returns to the table to gather her papers, now wet, now sticky with coffee, but still organized, still sorted by patient room number, still documenting something that will matter. The surgical staff begins to disperse. The moment has passed. The demonstration of power has been completed. Caldwell stands watching her, his expression suggesting satisfaction, his posture suggesting victory. He doesn't yet understand that he has made a critical error in his assessment. He doesn't yet know that the person kneeling on the floor of the Cedar Creek cafeteria at 7:51 a.m. on a Tuesday morning has spent 12 years in places where people fired at her while she worked. She continues her shift as though nothing has occurred. The cafeteria at Cedar Creek Medical hummed with the sound of 700 staff members moving through breakfast lines, but Dr. Caldwell's voice carried across the noise like a blade cutting through fabric. He stood near the surgical team's table, coffee in hand, his tailored suit the color of old money, his smile the smile of a man who had never been told no. "I'm making a bet," he announced, loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear. "The new girl won't last a week here. Any takers?" Scattered laughter rippled outward. A surgical intern leaned forward. "What's the wager, doctor?" "My reputation," Caldwell said, and the laughter doubled. "Which means it's a sure thing." Laura Bennett was 3 tables away, sitting with 2 other nurses who had been at Cedar Creek longer than she had. She held a cup of black coffee, her hands wrapped around the ceramic in the way of someone who had learned to find warmth wherever it existed. She didn't look up. Her ears had caught every word. A Master Chief Petty Officer's hearing was trained to gather intelligence in crowded spaces, to separate signal from noise, to identify threats from across a room. This was a threat. Not the violent kind she had faced in Fallujah under enemy fire. Something more calculated. Caldwell had discovered her digging through the billing codes. He knew she had seen the markups on MedTech Solutions invoices, the ones padded with 300% charges that had nothing to do with actual surgical supplies. He knew because men like him always knew when someone was asking questions about money. Money was the only language they truly understood. "Why would he say that?" whispered Nurse Chen, sitting across from Laura. "You're doing fine." Laura sipped her coffee. The liquid was lukewarm, which meant it had been sitting for several minutes. She had not yet touched it when Caldwell made his announcement. She lowered the cup. "Because he wants to establish hierarchy. He's testing the room. Seeing who laughs with him and who doesn't." Her voice remained level, conversational. "It's a power play. Happens in military units all the time. Alpha male establishes dominance by humiliating the newest member." "But you're not military," Chen said. Laura set the cup down carefully. "No. I'm just a nurse." The shift began at 8 o'clock. Laura worked the surgical floor that morning, checking post-op vitals on patients who had been in recovery since dawn. Room for 47 held the deaf Army Ranger. He was scheduled for his valve replacement in 48 hours, and the pre-op workup showed everything normal, ejection fraction at 52%, no arrhythmias, blood work clean. He was 81 years old and had been waiting 3 years for this surgery. His name was Marcus Webb. Laura checked his blood pressure, 142/88, elevated but acceptable for pre-op anxiety, and his oxygen sat was 98% on room air. She made notes on his chart in handwriting that was precise as surgical stitches. At noon, she carried her lunch tray through the cafeteria. Turkey sandwich on wheat, an apple, a bottle of water, and 3 patient charts stacked under her arm. She had reviewed those charts during her break, cross-referencing the dates on the surgical invoices with the dates of actual procedures. The patterns were too precise to be coincidence. Caldwell performed surgery on approximately 240 patients per year. Of those, 87 cases showed billing anomalies. That was a 36% infection rate of his caseload. That was intentional. That was systematic. She was thinking about those numbers when Dr. Caldwell stepped into her path. The motion was casual, almost accidental, his right arm extended as if he were reaching for a napkin from a nearby table. His forearm caught the edge of her tray. The physics of the moment were simple: a force applied perpendicular to an object in motion creates redirection. The tray tilted. Food scattered across the linoleum floor like shrapnel from an explosion. The apple rolled. The sandwich landed face down. The water bottle spilled in a widening arc. The charts exploded outward, pages flying in 3 different directions, scattering across 4 tables and onto the floor. The room went dead silent. 200 people stopped chewing. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The background noise of the cafeteria, the scrape of chairs, the hum of the serving line, the ambient conversation, simply ceased, as if someone had muted the world. Dr. Caldwell stood above her, his expression neutral, his eyes carrying something that looked almost like curiosity. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "We can't have the help making a mess." Help. Not colleague. Not nurse. Help. Laura was already moving. She did not hesitate. She did not look up at his face. She knelt on the linoleum floor, which was cool and slightly damp from the morning cleaning crew, and began gathering the scattered pages of Marcus Webb's pre-op chart. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, each page collected in order, each one aligned with the others, no trembling, no fumbling. Pain was information. Humiliation was information. Degradation was information. She had processed far worse. She had held a dying Marine in a convoy truck outside Fallujah while bullets tore through the canvas sides of the vehicle, had felt his blood warm against her hands, and had not allowed her focus to slip for a single second. This was different only in that no one was dying. Yet. The apple she placed on the plate. The sandwich she placed on the plate. The water bottle she set upright, though the water had already soaked into the floor. She stood, tray in one hand, charts in the other, and looked directly at Dr. Caldwell's face for the first time. His eyes were searching for something, a flinch, a breaking point, a sign that the machinery inside her had jammed. Laura's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. The only visible reaction to 700 people watching her be degraded in front of them. She did not cry. She did not protest. She did not speak. She simply carried the tray to the trash receptacle, disposed of the ruined food, and walked back to the surgical floor as if nothing had occurred. Behind her, she heard Caldwell's voice addressed to whoever was standing nearest. "See? No spine. She'll be gone by Friday." But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, as Laura was preparing to leave her shift, she found a notice taped to her locker. Reassignment. Effective immediately. She was being moved to the pediatric ward, 3rd floor, double shifts, starting the next morning. The handwriting on the form was not Caldwell's. It was the administrator's. Which meant Caldwell had called upstairs. Which meant he was escalating from social humiliation to institutional sabotage. He was using the system itself as a weapon. Laura removed the notice from her locker and read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in her pocket. She pulled out her personal phone and navigated to her email, scrolling through the messages she had sent that morning before her shift began. The compliance officer had received her documentation. The file was dated and time-stamped. The response email, sent at 2:51 p.m., read, "Thank you. We are reviewing your submission. Please maintain confidentiality per hospital protocol." She had covered herself. Protocol was being followed. But in the quiet of the locker room, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and laundry detergent, Laura allowed herself to breathe deeply. Her hands, steady through the entire cafeteria incident, finally rested against the cool metal of her locker. She was being reassigned to the pediatric ward because she had asked questions about money. She was being moved away from the surgical floor because a man with $847,000 in offshore accounts did not appreciate scrutiny. She was being pushed down because power recognizes threats, and she had become a threat. But here was what Dr. Caldwell did not know: Marcus Webb's valve replacement was scheduled for tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock. Operating Room 3. Caldwell was performing the surgery himself. And Laura had noticed something in the billing records that morning, something the compliance officer would not see for another 48 hours, an authorization for a secondary procedure, a cardiac catheterization, approved under an emergency protocol that did not exist. They were preparing to do additional work on a patient who had not consented to it. They were preparing to bill for services not rendered. They were preparing to commit fraud on a man who had carried her through Fallujah with a 9mm round in his leg. Laura closed her locker door softly. The sound echoed in the empty room. She did not flinch. She did not tremble. She simply turned on her heel and walked toward the pharmacy. She had access, technically, through her nursing credentials. She had questions, legitimately, about pre-op medications for morning surgeries. She had a right to review the drug inventory. She also had 12 years of combat medicine experience in a war zone. Muscle memory, as they said in the teams. It did not go away. The alarm on Laura's phone buzzed at 4:27 a.m. She'd set it for 45 minutes before her shift, a habit that refused to leave even after 6 years of civilian life. Muscle memory, as they said in the teams. It did not go away. She dressed in the dark, scrubs, white shoes, the combat boots laced tight underneath her jeans for the drive-in. Old habits. The boot stayed on until she reached the locker room. Cedar Creek Medical was a tomb before dawn. The parking garage echoed with footsteps that weren't hers. Laura's badge clipped to her collar, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead like something wounded trying to die. She moved through the corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people step aside without knowing why. That was power. Not volume. Not authority. Just the absolute certainty of someone who knew where they were going. Room 447 sat on the cardiac recovery floor, its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The Deaf Ranger lay in the pre-op bed, his eyes closed, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man still sleeping. His name was Marcus Webb. 28 years old. Bilateral sensorineural hearing loss from a roadside bomb in Fallujah. He'd been the 7th casualty that morning, the 7th name she'd written down in her field notes before everything went classified and those notes went classified with it. She didn't know his face would end up here. His left arm lay across the white blanket, the forearm turned slightly upward. Laura had to look. She'd promised herself she wouldn't, but her eyes moved there anyway, and there it was, her name. Bennett. Tattooed across his forearm in military stencil letters, the same handwriting style that appeared on every piece of equipment in a combat loadout. She dragged him 17 meters to the landing zone while rounds hammered the sandbags 3 feet away. He'd bled through 3 trauma dressings, and she'd packed them anyway, whispering things she didn't remember, things that didn't matter because he couldn't hear them. He'd lived. That was what mattered. Now he was scheduled for a valvular replacement. Routine, the chart said. Standard aortic valve replacement with bypass. 30-minute procedure, home in 3 days. Laura pulled the chart. Pre-op labs were solid. Ejection fraction at 52%. Cardiac function reasonable for a man his age, better than most. She flipped through the operative notes and felt something shift in her chest, not fear, but the cold clarity that came right before engagement. Caldwell's handwriting was sharp and precise, like the man himself. But the supply list made no sense. Grade: a pericardial allograft. Surgical grade anticoagulation protocol. A backup pump standing by. For a standard aortic valve replacement on a patient with normal function, it was overkill. It was the kind of specification that jacked up the costs by $40,000, maybe $50,000. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She'd watched Caldwell do this 6 times now in the past 3 months. He'd flag a patient as high risk, order the premium supplies, run up the bill, and the kickback from the medical equipment supplier would funnel into accounts that didn't exist on any Cedar Creek ledger. This one was different only because the patient was written in her own blood. She pulled out her phone and did the math in the hallway outside his room. $47,000. That was the difference between a standard procedure and what Caldwell had ordered. $47,000 that Marcus Webb's insurance would pay, that would get marked up another 20%, and that would disappear into offshore accounts and pharmaceutical kickbacks and the kind of corruption that made a man smile while he was killing people on a surgery schedule. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the overspecification wasn't just fraud. It was unnecessary. And unnecessary meant exposure. Unnecessary meant risk. Caldwell had ordered supplies for a catastrophic bleed because somewhere in his mind, he was still afraid. Still hedging. Still the kind of man who charged for soldiers instead of saving them. At 7:15 a.m., the orderlies came to transport Marcus to the OR. Laura watched them move his bed into the hallway. He'd woken up now, his eyes open, his hand signing something to the orderly who couldn't understand him. She saw his lips form words with the shape and precision of someone who'd learned to speak before he lost the ability to hear himself. The orderly patted his shoulder. "You're gonna be great, buddy," the man said, the words landing on dead ears. Marcus nodded anyway, the kind of polite accommodation that people with invisible wounds learn to perform. Laura followed at a distance, through the surgical corridor, past the observation gallery entrance. She wasn't scheduled for the OR rotation today. Caldwell had seen to that. She'd been reassigned to pediatrics, to the end of the hospital where she couldn't see, couldn't interfere, couldn't ask questions about supply lists and unnecessary procedures. But the observation gallery was neutral ground. No one asked why you were there. The gallery overlooked the OR like a cathedral overlooking its congregation. Laura stood at the glass, hands folded, and watched Marcus wheel into Theatre 4. The surgical staff moved like a choreographed unit, nurses, technicians, anesthesia attending. Caldwell entered last, moving with the kind of swagger that came from knowing no one would challenge him. His face was focused but relaxed. This was his world. This was where his power lived. The procedure began at 7:27 a.m. The monitors showed clean vital signs. Heart rate steady in the 60s. Blood pressure normal. Oxygen saturation at 98%. Standard bypass protocol initiated. The pump whirred to life with a sound like machinery settling into work. Caldwell's hands moved with visible competence. There was no denying he had skill. He could open a chest with precision. The problem was what he did inside it. At 8:03 a.m., the monitors changed. Blood pressure dropped from 110 to 88 to 67. The monitor beeped twice, then found a rhythm of frantic beeping, a sound like panic translated into electronics. The heart rate spiked. The pulse pressure narrowed. On the screen, Laura saw what the surgical team saw, the classic signs of tamponade. Fluid in the pericardium. The sac around the heart filling with blood, pressure building, the organ crushed from the outside like a fist around a beating bird. Caldwell froze. It was just for a second, barely visible, but it was there. His hand hung suspended above the operative field. His eyes moved to the anesthesia monitoring screen and stayed there. He wasn't frozen in thought. He was frozen in panic. He was a man who'd built a career on predictability, on controlling outcomes, on knowing exactly what would happen if he followed the protocol he'd written down. And now something was happening that his protocol didn't account for. "Get me?" He started, then stopped. His eyes scanned the room as if looking for someone else to blame, someone else to tell him what to do. Laura was already moving. She'd pushed through the gallery door and was down the stairs, her feet hitting them with a rhythm that sounded like purpose. No hesitation. No thought. This was muscle memory in its purest form, the 12 years of training, the 3 tours, the 2 operations classified so deep that even the Pentagon had redacted them from her file. This was the thing that lived under her ribs, the thing she'd buried in civilian life but never removed. The surgical doors had a push plate designed to open from inside the hallway. Laura used her hip. The nurse at the scrub desk looked up, mouth opening to say something about protocol and authorization, but Laura was already past her and into the sterile field. She grabbed a large bore needle from the surgical tray, a 14-gauge angiocath, the kind designed for emergency decompression. Her movements were fluid. Not rushed. Not desperate. The kind of precision that came from having done this under fire with rounds impacting the structure around her. Pericardiocentesis, she said, her voice level and calm, the voice of someone giving an order not asking for permission. She didn't wait for Caldwell to respond. She positioned herself at the patient's left side, the needle angled below the xiphoid process, the trajectory toward the left shoulder. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the compression of 12 years of command into absolute stillness. The needle advanced. The resistance changed as it pierced the pericardium. She felt it like information, pain was data, and her hands were reading it perfectly. She aspirated, drawing back on the plunger, and dark blood filled the syringe. Not arterial. Not venous. The deep red-black of decompensated fluid, of pressure and suffocation and a heart being crushed from outside. The moment the fluid left the pericardium, the pressure released. The heart could beat again. The monitors changed in real time, blood pressure climbing from 67 to 78 to 92. Heart rate stabilizing. The frantic beeping slowed to something almost normal, a rhythm that sounded like breathing. The room exhaled. Caldwell's face had gone from pale to flushed, the color of a man watching his world rearrange itself. He looked at Laura with an expression she recognized, not gratitude, but something deeper. Something that looked like fear. He just watched someone walk into his OR, into his domain, and do the thing he couldn't do. He'd watched his authority evaporate in the time it took to draw back a syringe. "Get her out of my OR," he said quietly. The words were soft but absolute. Security arrived at the gallery entrance at 8:17 a.m. Not rushing. Not dramatic. Just two officers in blue blazers, their faces set in the neutral expression of men who'd been called to perform a task they didn't entirely understand. Laura surrendered the needle, stepped back from the operative field, and walked toward them without being asked twice. The observation of rank was complete. She'd broken protocol. She'd stepped into Caldwell's space. She'd done the thing he couldn't do and made it visible to every person in that theater. By 9:19 a.m., she was standing in the administrator's office while a man named Mitchell Chen, with hair that had gone gray at the temples and eyes that suggested he'd seen this kind of thing before, read from a file that his hands were shaking slightly while holding. Unauthorized procedures. Falsified credentials. Violation of surgical protocol. His voice was careful, professional, the voice of someone reading lines he'd been written and didn't entirely believe. Effective immediately, you're placed on suspension pending investigation. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She listened, nodded once, and walked back through the hallway toward the locker room with her badge in her hand, thinking about the way Marcus Webb's heart had resumed its rhythm, the way the monitors had found stability, the way a 12-year-old tattoo with her name on it had just received new meaning it was never supposed to have. The combat boots were waiting in her locker. She sat down on the bench and laced them one more time, muscle memory completing the circle. By noon, she was on the street with a file in her hands and absolutely nowhere to go. The monitor beeped once. The arterial line straightened. Sinus rhythm held steady at 84 beats per minute. The fluid that had been crushing Marcus Webb's heart was gone, drained through a needle no thicker than a strand of copper wire, and the ranger's oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 92% in the time it took Dr. Caldwell to comprehend what had just happened in his own surgical theater. His face darkened like a storm rolling across the Atlantic. Not the storm of relief. The storm of a man watching his world collapse in real time. He had known about the billing codes for 4 years. $47,000 per case, inflated charges funneled through Apex Medical Supply, a company that didn't exist anywhere except on invoices and in the offshore accounts he'd been building since 2019. The kickback arrangement was clean, automated, invisible. Until a 3-month-old nurse started pulling medical records at 2 in the morning and started asking questions nobody was supposed to ask. He'd handled that with the cafeteria tray, with the bet, with reassignment to pediatrics. He'd handled her with the tools that always worked: public humiliation, institutional power, the weight of a system that protected its own. But he hadn't handled her at all. She was still here. And now she'd just performed a procedure that wasn't hers to perform, one that would have to be documented, one that everyone in this operating room had witnessed, which meant he couldn't bury it in the billing codes the way he buried everything else. Caldwell's hands clenched at his sides. His attending, Dr. Patricia Moss, was already making notes. The nursing staff was staring at Laura as if she'd just walked out of mythology. The anesthesiologist had gone pale. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Just the sound of the ventilator cycling, the heart monitor's steady rhythm, the hiss of oxygen flowing into Marcus Webb's lungs, sounds of a life that Laura Bennett had just saved using nothing but training that didn't exist in any official file, hands that had no business being that steady, instinct that belonged to someone who had spent 20 years learning how to keep people alive in places where death came at the speed of sound. Caldwell stepped back from the table. His jaw was locked. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and controlled, a surgeon's voice, professional and precise. "Close him up, Dr. Moss. Excellent work." He didn't look at Laura. He didn't acknowledge the procedure. He simply removed his gloves with deliberate slowness, one finger at a time, and walked out of the operating room without another word. By 11 that morning, Dr. Caldwell had made 4 phone calls. The first was to Bernard Sterling, a board member who'd been allowing Caldwell to handle surgical contracts for 3 years in exchange for favorable billing arrangements on Sterling's own hospital interests. Sterling picked up on the second ring. "There's a credentialing issue," Caldwell said simply. "A nurse performed an unauthorized advanced procedure without supervision. I need this documented and escalated today. I'm thinking termination and possibly licensing review." Sterling, who understood perfectly what Caldwell was doing and why, agreed immediately. 1 phone call. 1 favor activated. The second was to Judge Patricia Coleman, who sat on the hospital's credentialing committee and whose daughter had received a full scholarship to Columbia Medical School courtesy of Caldwell's anonymous donation 3 years prior. "Patricia, I need administrative support for a personnel issue. This is time-sensitive. I'm forwarding you documentation within the hour." She didn't ask questions. She promised her vote. The third call was to Michael Russo at the State Medical Licensing Board. Russo owed Caldwell $15,000 in gambling debts, money that Caldwell had covered through a private loan arrangement that conveniently existed nowhere in writing. "Michael, I need you to flag a nursing license for immediate investigation. Falsified credentials, unauthorized procedures, violation of scope of practice. Name is Laura Bennett. I'm sending the paperwork." Russo's voice was tight with the knowledge of what this really was: the activation of leverage, the calling in of a debt, the reminder that his financial life depended on Caldwell's discretion. "I'll have someone reach out to her within 24 hours, Russo said. The fourth call was to Richard Hayes, a private investigator who specialized in background checks and who had made $300,000 over the past decade digging up dirt on hospital staff members at Caldwell's request. "I need everything on a Laura Bennett, 3 months at Cedar Creek. Prior employment, education history, gaps, anything that doesn't fit. Make it thorough. Make it look legitimate." Hayes had already learned, in 10 years of this work, that make it look legitimate meant fabricate if necessary. He promised results by end of business. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Dr. Caldwell sat in the office of Dr. Sandra Yates, the hospital administrator, with a folder containing printed emails, incident reports he'd authored himself, and the preliminary findings from Hayes' investigation, a document that already contained 3 separate employment discrepancies that didn't actually exist but which, when cross-referenced with the state licensing board's sudden inquiry, would look devastating. "She performed an advanced cardiac procedure without authorization," Caldwell explained, his voice measured and concerned. "She has no documentation of training in pericardiocentesis. Her resume lists 3 months at a clinic in Nevada and nothing before that, no prior employment history, no educational transcript. When I asked her directly about her background, she refused to provide details, claimed she couldn't discuss prior work. I'm concerned she may have falsified her credentials to obtain the position. He slid the folder across the desk. The state licensing board has already begun an inquiry. Dr. Yates, a career administrator more familiar with liability than medicine, opened the folder with the expression of someone holding a loaded weapon. Falsified credentials meant lawsuits. Lawsuits meant insurance claims, board scrutiny, public embarrassment. An unauthorized procedure meant scope of practice violations, potential patient harm allegations, regulatory exposure. She didn't ask if the procedure had saved the patient's life. She didn't ask if the patient had consented or if the outcome was positive. She asked only one question: can we verify her credentials? We cannot, Caldwell said. She will not provide the information necessary to verify them. That itself is suspicious. By 3 o'clock, Laura was sitting in that same office, facing the administrator across a desk that suddenly felt the size of an operating table. Dr. Yates had pulled the file, the incident report, written entirely by Caldwell, and the preliminary findings from the state licensing board's inquiry, which had arrived via email at 2:15 p.m. Your employment history, Dr. Yates began, lists a 3-month position at a clinic in Nevada. Before that, nothing. No prior employment, no education records, no references we can verify. You performed an advanced cardiac procedure this morning without proper authorization or documentation of training. When Dr. Caldwell asked about your background, you refused to provide information. Can you explain this? Laura's hands were folded on her lap. Her breathing was steady. Her face was composed in that way that had become her armor here, jaw tight, eyes level, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had learned to absorb blows without flinching. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then, I am qualified. That's not sufficient, Dr. Yates said. I need documentation. Education, prior employment, proof of advanced cardiac training. Without that, I cannot keep you on staff. Hospital liability is too high. I cannot discuss my prior work, Laura said quietly. The words hung in the air like a confession. Dr. Yates stared at her. You cannot, or you will not. Both, Laura said. By 4 o'clock, hospital security had been notified. By 4:15, a guard was escorting Laura Bennett from the building. She stopped at the badge reader at the front entrance and surrendered her credentials, the white lanyard with the temporary nurse badge that had meant nothing and everything all at once. The guard, whose name was Tommy and who had seen her help a confused dementia patient find their way back to their room at 2 in the morning 3 weeks prior, looked genuinely sorry. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly as she handed over the badge. Yes, Laura said, I did. She was aware of the whispers. She was aware of Dr. Caldwell, standing on the second-floor balcony overlooking the lobby, his arms crossed, watching her walk toward the exit. She was aware of his small smile, the smile of a man who had just eliminated a problem using nothing but leverage and institutional power, the smile of someone who believed he had won. She didn't look up at him. That evening, at 9:30 p.m., Laura returned to Cedar Creek Medical through the employee entrance. The night shift was in full momentum, the ER was running steady, the floors were quiet, the staff was focused. Nobody noticed her moving through the corridors in civilian clothes, carrying nothing but a tote bag and her car keys. She went to the hospital laundry, which sat in the basement near the loading dock, a cavernous room lined with industrial washers and dryers that hummed with the kind of mechanical persistence that required no thought and offered no judgment. On a shelf marked Processing, March 15th, she found the bin with her scrubs, 3 sets of navy blues, 2 pairs of black joggers, the borrowed surgical cap she'd worn for 2 weeks before requesting her own. She took them out one by one. The first pair of scrubs she folded with the precision of someone who had been trained to move efficiently in spaces where seconds mattered. Crisp edges. Perfect corners. The folder rectangle so clean it looked like it had been cut from sheet metal rather than cloth. She set it on the laundry table. Picked up the second pair. Folded it with the same methodical care, left side in, right side in, bottom folded up, then lengthwise, then the final fold that compressed 3 months of 12-hour shifts into something compact and portable and finished. The laundry attendant, a woman named Helen who was 63 and who worked nights because it paid better and because she'd learned long ago that the night shift asked fewer questions, watched from her chair near the folding station. After the third pair of scrubs, Helen spoke quietly, "You didn't deserve this." Laura didn't respond. She just continued folding, her jaw working silently, her eyes fixed on the fabric in her hands, fabric that had absorbed blood and saline solution and the sweat of standing 12 hours in a trauma bay, fabric that had been the only visible part of her uniform in this place where she'd tried to disappear into civilian life the way she'd been ordered to disappear 6 years ago. She placed all 3 pairs in a neat stack and moved to the personnel lockers along the far wall. Her locker, number 47, was small and had contained almost nothing, a spare pair of socks, a granola bar she'd never opened, and a locked metal box she'd bought at a hardware store in Cherry Hill. She opened the box for the first time in 3 months. Inside was a pair of worn combat boots, tan leather, scuffed and creased, the laces double-knotted in a way that nobody taught you but everyone learned. Beside them lay a dog tag on a silver chain, the name Bennett, L etched in tiny military lettering. Beneath that was a photograph, 5 inches by 7 inches, laminated against water damage, 7 soldiers in tactical gear, standing in front of a Humvee in Fallujah, their faces dust-covered and exhausted, but their eyes bright with the kind of clarity that only comes when you've kept your unit alive another day. She was in the photograph. Second from the left. 28 years old. A decade before the medical school, before the Navy Cross, before the classified operation that had gone sideways and gotten 3 good people killed and gotten her order to vanish into a civilian identity so complete that nobody could ever connect Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett to the nurse working night shifts at Cedar Creek Medical. She closed the box. Locked it. Placed it back in the locker with the same care she'd used to fold her scrubs. And then she walked out of Cedar Creek Medical at 9:47 p.m., carrying only the locked box and her purse, wearing civilian clothes that made her look like anyone else, just another person leaving a job, just another person moving on to the next thing, just another person whose life had imploded on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning and no recourse and no way to fight back without revealing everything she'd been ordered to hide. In her car, parked in the 3rd level of the employee garage under a light that hummed with the kind of electric exhaustion that matched her own, Laura allowed her composure to crack for exactly 30 seconds. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. Her breathing came in shaking gasps that she couldn't quite control. Her eyes stung with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 20 years, not quite tears, not quite surrender, something in between that felt like all of it at once. She closed her eyes. Breathed. Counted to 10. Then wiped her face with the back of her hand and started the engine. The car moved through the parking garage toward the exit. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical was still running, still saving lives, still processing billing codes, still operating under the assumption that nobody had noticed anything, that nothing had changed, that Dr. Caldwell had successfully contained the problem and that tomorrow would be exactly like every other day. Laura knew better. She'd spent 20 years learning that tomorrow was never like any other day. Tomorrow was when something you didn't expect arrived and changed everything. Tomorrow was when the past stopped being buried and started walking through your life in civilian clothes, carrying a classified file, speaking a rank that hadn't belonged to you for 6 years. Tomorrow was coming. But tonight, she drove home alone, carrying her locked box, carrying her past, carrying the knowledge that there were people in this city who knew exactly who she was, and that knowledge was about to cost someone everything. The morning light filtered through the hospital parking garage in pale yellow slabs as Laura pushed through the staff entrance at 6:47 a.m., before most of Cedar Creek Medical came alive. Her badge was no longer valid, but Marcus, the security guard who'd served in Baghdad, waved her through without checking. He knew. She could see it in the way his eyes held hers for a half-second longer than necessary, not pity, but recognition. She'd been fired 12 hours ago. Now she was here to collect the few things that mattered, her locker, her final check, the box of belongings she'd left behind in the chaos of Caldwell's destruction. The locker room on the 4th floor was empty. 6:50 a.m. meant the shift change hadn't started yet, the morning crew still pulling on their scrubs at home or in their cars, none of them knowing yet what Laura knew, that everything had shifted in the night. She dialed her combination, 48 12 33. The door swung open. Inside sat her personal items, a photo of her mother in Denver, a dog-eared copy of a military medical manual she'd never fully escaped, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a canvas bag she'd kept hidden for 8 years, the pair of worn combat boots. Fallujah mud still caked the left heel. She'd never had them cleaned. Some things you don't clean. Some things you carry as weight, as proof, as the only honest thing you own. She pulled the boots free and held them. The leather was cracked from desert sun and sweat from 1,000 patrols. Her hands knew the weight before her mind remembered she was allowed to feel it. She was turning the first boot over in her palms when the orderlies' voices reached her from the hallway, 3 of them, moving fast, the crash of a gurney being rushed, the abbreviated speech of emergency protocol. She tensed. Even fired, 8 hours gone, her body still responded to the sound of crisis. Then the voices grew closer and something in her spine went rigid. The accent. The broken English mixing with something else, Arabic, rapid-fire, urgent, the kind of vocal urgency that only came from recognition. The orderlies wheeled past her open locker. The patient on the gurney was a man in his early 50s, dark-skinned, a bandage wrapping his lower left abdomen, his eyes wide and locked directly on Laura's face. He began to shout. Al-Shaba! Al-Shaba! The ghost! Fallujah! His voice cracked like he was calling across a canyon. You are her. The one with the star on her chest. He tried to rise from the gurney and the orderlies pushed him back down gently, one of them hissing at him to stay still, but his eyes never left Laura's. Fallujah, 2015. I know you. I remember. The smoke was so thick. You pulled 3 of us from the rubble when the buildings came down. Do you remember? Do you? The locker room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. The boots fell from her hands. Muscle memory took over, she stepped back, moved behind the locker door, but it was too late. The words were already loose in the air like shrapnel, bouncing off every tile in the room. Marcus appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, the same guard who'd let her through, his face the color of drywall. He was looking at Laura like he was seeing her for the first time, or maybe seeing her exactly as she had been and had spent 8 years trying not to be. Master Chief, he said quietly. Not a question. A salute without the hand movement. Don't, Laura said, her voice level. That name isn't. Is it true? He wasn't aggressive, wasn't demanding. Just asking. The way you ask when you already know the answer and you're asking out of respect for the moment. She didn't respond. She picked up the boots. She was walking toward the exit when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was 202, Washington, D.C., the kind of call that didn't come to people who were supposed to disappear. She let it ring. It rang again, immediately, same number. A third time. She answered. Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett. The voice was clipped, military, a woman with the kind of authority that came from giving orders that moved people across continents. This is Commander Sarah Hayes, Navy Personnel Command. There's a situation developing at Cedar Creek Medical. We need you to stand by. We're sending a liaison. Do not leave the building. It's not a request. The line went dead. Within 40 minutes, the hospital conference room on the executive level had filled with people who had no right to be there. A Navy liaison officer named Commander Hayes sat at the head of the polished oak table with a classified file that made the hospital's CFO nervous just looking at it. The hospital administrator had been called in. 2 board members. Marcus stood against the back wall, no longer just security. And Laura sat at the table with her hands flat, waiting. Commander Hayes opened the file. She didn't ask permission. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Service record, 23 years, United States Navy, SEAL Training Command attached. 3 deployments to classified operational areas, 2 of which remain under redaction authority pending declassification. She paused, letting the word settle. Medal record, Bronze Star for service. She waited. A board member leaned forward. Silver Star for Valor under fire, Operation Enduring Freedom, 2014. Another pause. The room understood now that there was a rhythm to this, that each medal required its own moment to land. Second Silver Star, 2015, for evacuation under hostile fire. Caldwell's former associate, still sitting in the room, because nobody had yet thrown him out, was beginning to understand that whatever he thought he'd done, it was nothing. Purple Heart, 2014. Purple Heart, 2016. Hayes looked directly at Laura. And the Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism Under Fire, Fallujah, June 2015, citation reads, for extraordinary heroism while engaged in combat operations against an armed enemy. Master Chief Bennett refused to leave a position until all personnel were evacuated, then provided medical care to 7 wounded soldiers under active fire, sustaining injuries herself, refusing evacuation until all 7 were secure. The room was silent in the way that only profound silence exists, not the absence of sound, but the presence of collective understanding that everything in the room had changed weight and dimension. The door opened. They wheeled in the Ranger. Marcus Webb, 72 years old now, deaf since a mortar round took his hearing in 2013, the one patient who'd survived Caldwell's greed because Laura had been there. He was awake, his eyes sharp, and when he saw Laura sitting at that table, he made a sound, a low, guttural sound that deaf people make when they're trying to speak from the chest, from somewhere deeper than voice, and he raised his left arm. He pulled up his sleeve. There, in faded black ink on skin that had aged into wrinkles, was a tattoo, Bennett saved my life when 7 others ran. He began to sign, his hands moving with the precision of someone speaking a language they'd never forget. An orderly interpreted quietly, "That's her. That's the one. That's Master Chief." At 3:15 p.m., a medical student's phone uploaded to Twitter. The video had been filmed 4 days earlier in the Cedar Creek cafeteria. It showed Dr. Caldwell in high definition, his face clear, his voice unmuffled. "Pick that up, sweetheart. We can't have the help making a mess." He was laughing. Other doctors laughed with him. The student had captioned it with 3 words, Navy Cross. Treated like trash. Within 60 minutes, the video had 40,000 shares. Within 2 hours, 200,000. News outlets picked it up, MSNBC ran it during the afternoon cycle, CNN ran it during prime time. By 7 p.m., it had hit 1 million shares. The comment sections filled with active-duty military, veterans, nurses, patients, asking the same question, "Who is this doctor?" The hospital was already fielding calls. Cedar Creek Medical's PR department issued a statement, "We are investigating." At 8:45 p.m., Dr. Raymond Herschel, the former Army surgeon who had trained Dr. Caldwell in medical school 31 years ago, released a public statement through his personal Twitter account. Herschel was decorated, respected, the kind of doctor whose opinion still moved institutional opinion. He wrote, "I am ashamed to have trained Dr. Caldwell. His behavior in this video is a disgrace to the medical profession and an insult to the service members we are obligated to protect. I disavow any association with him, past or present." By midnight, 3 board members were requesting an emergency meeting. The board convened at 7 a.m. the next morning. Board Chairman Whitmore, who had taken money from Caldwell's network for years, tried to defend him. He suggested the video was taken out of context, suggested Laura might have been difficult, suggested that everyone deserved due process. 2 other board members, Hendricks and Chen, stood immediately. They resigned. They did it in the meeting itself, in front of everyone, and they told the chairwoman they would be going public with their objections to the hospital's handling of the situation. The vote was 5-2 in favor of immediate suspension. Caldwell was informed by phone at 8:30 a.m. His lawyer told him to cooperate. The State Medical Licensing Board opened an investigation by 9:15. The private investigator Caldwell had hired, tasked with finding dirt on Laura, had stumbled across something much darker in Cedar Creek's financial systems. He reported irregularities. The licensing board subpoenaed the hospital's billing records. By Monday afternoon, auditors had found the pattern: $1.2 million in inflated charges over 4 years, payments funneled to an offshore account in Grand Cayman in the name of a shell corporation that led back to Caldwell's brother-in-law. MedTech Solutions CEO, facing federal charges, flipped. He provided emails. He provided wire transfers. He provided a decade of evidence that Caldwell had been systematizing fraud, that it was operational, that it was deliberate. By Wednesday, Caldwell's lawyer advised him to cooperate fully. It was his only path to avoiding imprisonment. By Friday, 1 week after the video went live, the board voted to terminate Caldwell's employment and report him for fraud to the federal prosecutor's office. The state medical board suspended his license indefinitely. His wife filed for divorce. His name was removed from the hospital donor wall where it had hung for 15 years. He sat alone in his now empty office, the diplomas already taken down by staff, the files boxed up, the space stripped of him as though he'd never existed. His hands were trembling. He tried to call his oldest son. The call went to voicemail. 6 months later, on a grey Thursday morning in October, Laura Bennett stood in her new office on the 9th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. The office was modest, but it was hers. The title on the door read, Director, Veterans Care Wing. The position had been created specifically for her, funded through a combination of hospital discretionary money and a private donation from Dr. Herschel himself. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Schuylkill River. On her desk, no longer hidden in a box, sat the pair of worn combat boots. The mud was still there. She decided not to clean them. Sergeant Kowalski, the deaf ranger, came by twice a week for his cardiac rehab. He and Laura communicated in sign language, fast and fluid, the language she'd learned in Fallujah because you learn the language of survival. He brought other veterans with him, a woman from the Army Medical Corps with a traumatic brain injury, a man from the Marines with bilateral amputations, 3 others from different services and different wars. They came to Laura's wing because they knew they'd be understood there. They knew the person in charge had stood where they stood. The Iraqi asylum seeker, the man who'd recognized her in the hallway, had been resettled with a job and a work visa, and now he volunteered in the veteran section 3 days a week, translating for other refugees who arrived at Cedar Creek. He would stand near Laura's office sometimes and just nod, the way you nod at someone who saved your life and never asked for gratitude. That evening, the hospital held a formal recognition ceremony in the main auditorium for new nursing hires. Over 200 staff members attended. Laura stood at the podium in front of them all. She didn't talk about military service. She didn't talk about medals or Fallujah or any of it. She talked about integrity. She talked about the difference between having credentials and having character. She talked about the moment when you have to choose between protecting the system and protecting the patient, and how the right choice is always the harder one. She concluded, true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The room applauded. Marcus, now head of hospital security, shook her hand afterward. Dr. Yates, the chief of surgery, thanked her publicly. That night, alone in her office, Laura pulled open a locked drawer and removed a photograph she hadn't looked at in 8 years. 7 soldiers in full gear, standing in rubble, dust still hanging in the air around them. She was the smallest of the 7, her face covered, but her eyes were visible and you could see she was calm, the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. All 7 of them alive. All 7 because she refused to leave anyone behind. She propped the photo on her desk next to the boots, finally allowing her past and present to exist in the same room, side by side, no longer separated by classification or secrecy or fear. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus, you coming to the ceremony tomorrow? She typed back, already confirmed. Outside, the city lights flickered on like small acknowledgements. Below her window, the streets of Philadelphia carried people to their homes, their versions of their lives, none of them knowing that in one office on the 9th floor, a woman who had survived everything was finally allowed to exist as herself. If you've ever faced someone who tried to diminish you for their own gain, if you've ever stayed silent when staying silent cost you, please like and subscribe. Share your story in the comments. And if you know healthcare workers fighting corruption in their institutions, nominate them. They're the real heroes. The ones who stand when everyone else walks away.